Manu, what are you learning?
Yeah, that's right. A source close to the Republican leader tells me that the Senate Majority Leader is upset at President Trump over his handling of this episode, believing that the president could be potentially opening up long festering racial tensions. This, of course, Mitch McConnell has a long history on working on civil rights issues. The concern from the Senate Majority Leader is that the president, by his comments yesterday, essentially could be undercutting the years of work that has been done on these civil rights issues. Now, Senator McConnell actually has not put out a statement since yesterday, raising questions about why he has not joined a lot of other Republicans in going after President Trump. One reason why, I'm told by this source, is that the Senate Majority Leader is concerned about this looking like retribution because of their fight that happened last week. Remember that spat that occurred between President Trump and Mitch McConnell that occurred when the president accused Mitch McConnell of failing on health care, failing to deliver a key vote on health care. That after Mitch McConnell said the president may have had excessive expectations about what he could accomplish coming in. Mitch McConnell not wanting to look like he's getting into a back and forth with the president, but behind the scenes, John, I'm told that McConnell has had concerns with the president over this whole Charlottesville episode, wants to make that very clear. I think we can expect him to say something publicly as soon as today on this, just adding another voice to this episode. But one other reason why, John, is that there's some concern about going too hard after the president. They still have to work together, particularly in September, when the government needs to be funded past September 30th to avoid a government shutdown, when they need to raise the national debt ceiling to avoid a debt default. They're going to have to do a lot of work together. So McConnell has been cautious about this, but expect some potentially strong words coming out soon, even as his home state of Kentucky, John, and Lexington, where demonstrations could take place there. Some white supremacists warning that they may do that as well, John.
And one of the really interesting parts of this, of course, is that Mitch McConnell's wife, Elaine Chao, was standing next to the President of the United States when he said all of these things, which I'm sure doesn't make the situation any easier for the senator.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, afterwards, she was asked specifically by reporters about the flap that occurred last week, and she said that she stands by both men, referring to both President Trump and the Senate Majority Leader. But, of course, that adds a little bit of awkwardness, if you will, particularly if that event, John, as you know, was about infrastructure. She's the transportation secretary. She's going to have to shepherd this through, and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell will have to get that enacted pass through the Senate if they were to achieve one of President Trump's chief objectives here. But just showing, John, that the president's remarks yesterday getting criticism from all fronts and making it harder and overshadowing things that they're trying to do on Capitol Hill, John.
All right, Manu Raju, thank you so much for your reporting. I want to go back to Charlottesville, where the public memorial for Heather Heyer set to begin. Industry leaders out of the President's Business Council. CNN Chief Money Correspondent Christine Romans joins me now. What's going on here?
And, you know, there are a lot of other ones who are deciding whether they should stay here. Look, Richard Trumka, who runs the AFL-CIO, also Thea Lee, who's at the AFL-CIO, they both said that they're not going to be advising this president anymore. Richard Trumka this morning on another network saying, frankly, they hadn't even met. And so this idea of making manufacturing great again, it wasn't really getting off the ground anyway. You can also see Scott Paul there for the Alliance for American Manufacturing, a lobby group for American manufacturers, also leaving. This is after Merck, Under Armour, Intel, those CEOs left the President's Advisory Council. And even more notably, the Walmart CEO, who's on a different advisory board, the Walmart CEO out with pretty sharp comments in a message to his own employees. Keep in mind, Doug McMillon runs a company, Walmart, that is basically kind of Main Street America, right? It's got the largest private sector workforce in the country, about a million and a half workers. He said this: "We, too, felt that he missed a critical opportunity of Donald Trump, the president, to help bring our country together by unequivocally rejecting the appalling actions of white supremacists." So you're seeing companies, the business class, breaking with the business president here because they are not in step on this issue, just like they're not in step on climate change, just like they're not in step on other issues as well. you know, that immigration is one noted a departure as well.
Yeah, Doug McMillon, the president was asked about him yesterday, and you could see it sort of got to him a little bit. He says he knows Doug McMillon, but that was a political statement from the head of Walmart. They're interesting. We talked to Javier Palmeras, who's the chair of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I know you know Javier.
Yeah.
He's sticking around. He's staying in the Diversity Council because he thinks he can have a voice. How much pressure do you think these guys are feeling?
You know, they are feeling a lot of pressure from their shareholders, from their customers. There was a big online push on social media for Campbell Soup, for that CEO to step back, saying it's just not in step with, like, the image that they want as that company. There are CEOs, though, who say, look, we think we should have a seat at the table. We want to be there and talk about manufacturing and talk about American jobs. But it is notable how much pressure these CEOs are under. There's also kind of a feeling among some of them that there's a post-Trump world now. There's a pro-business environment. Maybe they still will get a tax cut down the line, but they're kind of looking beyond the drama in the White House toward their own businesses.
All right, Christine Roman, it's great to have you here with us. Thanks so much. All right, President Trump lashed out at the removal of Confederate statues. Now 4 more monuments to Confederate icons taken down overnight. That happened in the city of Baltimore. We will speak to the city's mayor.
He is not a racist, I can tell you that. He's a good person. He actually gets a very unfair press in that regard. But we'll see what happens with Mr. Bannon. But he's a good person, and I think the press treats him, frankly, very unfairly.
President of the United States talking about Chief Strategist Steve Bannon, whose fate is not any clearer this morning, though. A member of the President's Diversity Council is calling for Steve Bannon to resign. Joining me now, Javier Palmeras. He is the President and CEO of the United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, a member of the Diversity Council. Javier, always great to see you. Your group, the Hispanic Chamber, put out a statement after the President's initial response to Charlottesville. It said this: denouncing white supremacy without equivocation or without reservation should have been a no-brainer for President Trump. And the group went on to say that it will continue to work with the White House, but the administration's behavior makes continuing that role exceedingly difficult. That was after Saturday. After yesterday, after the president made even more clear where his heart and head is on this matter, will you continue to work with the White House?
You know, let me begin by saying, John, that a clear, unequivocal denunciation of anti-Semitism, of Nazis, of white supremacy was the order of the day. The president missed that moment. And these are the moments that define a presidency. These are the moments that define a president. We will continue to serve in the capacity, but only because it is my constituency that is asking me to stay in the role. I represent American small businesses, women-owned businesses that collectively contribute over $668 billion to the American economy. Our job is to make sure that our small businesses, our American job creators and taxpayers, have a voice in this administration, frankly, in any administration. So the path forward is clear. We stay the course, but I have to say it is a sad day for the American people, and I call on this president to remove Steve Bannon. I think that would be a clear signal that he understands the gravity of the situation and that he is taking steps to remove this anti-Semitism, this nexus of hate-filled rhetoric that is right down the hall from the Oval Office.
Steve Bannon wasn't in Trump Tower yesterday. As far as we know, Steve Bannon hasn't talked to the president since Saturday over the last few days. They may have exchanged some text messages here, but this wasn't a Steve Bannon statement. This was a statement from President Trump. So why do you think removing Bannon will change anything?
Absolutely, the president owns what has happened here. This is a clear failure on behalf of the president and the rest of the administration. But Bannon's influence and his fingerprints are all over this. At the end of the day, Steve Bannon is against everything my association stands for. Let's think about this for just a moment. Steve Bannon is anti-globalization, not realizing that 95% of the global market exists outside of the United States, and our businesses, in order to grow, must play in the global marketplace. Steve Bannon is anti-immigrant, not realizing that 42% of America's Fortune 500 corporations were started by immigrants.
I totally get this, and absolutely, I understand from an economic standpoint, at a minimum, why your group opposes Steve Bannon. But you're ready to quit Steve Bannon for the president's comments, but you're not ready to quit the president.
Absolutely, I'm ready to quit the president. I don't serve this president. I serve the American taxpayers who put me in this role. I don't want to conflate the two. I serve at the pleasure of the American small business owners who are asking me to stay the course and to ensure that American small business has a voice in this or any administration. Whether I agree with the president or not has nothing to do with it, really, John.
And I understand that, and I appreciate where you're coming from on that. So the next time the Diversity Council meets with the President of the United States, the next time you have a chance to say something to him, what will you say?
We're not waiting for a meeting. We're sending our message right now. Clearly, I'm sending it right here and right now. He has failed this moment. He needs to make sure that he understands the gravity of the situation and that he owns it. He needs to act presidential. He needs to bring this country together. That's why he's in that White House. That's why he's in our White House.
Have you seen any sign that he will act the way you want him to?
You know, I remain hopeful. There are people around him, like Ivanka, like Secretary Perdue, like Secretary Perry, like Secretary Mnuchin, who I do work with constantly. And I'm hopeful that those voices will win out and that he will see the error of his ways and do the right thing by the American people.
Javier Palmeras, as I said, always nice to talk to you. Thanks so much for coming in for us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
All right, the alt-right is praising him. The White House is digging in. Talking points urging Republicans to say that the president is entirely correct. That's next.
I have asthma, one of many pieces in my life.
Good morning, everyone. John Berman here. The big question this morning is, what now? What now after the president made his feelings crystal clear on the violence and deaths sparked by white supremacists this weekend? What now for Republicans critical of the president's words on hate, but less critical of the man or his agenda? What now for the White House staff, including those of the Jewish faith, a faith that was slandered loudly and clearly on the streets of Charlottesville? What now for the military, whose leaders have made unusual, bold statements in reaction, if not opposition, to the president's words? What now for the family of Heather Heyer? She was killed, perhaps murdered, because of the hate. Her memorial begins shortly. What now for the United States, all the United States, and its ongoing struggle to understand its own complicated heritage? The president's comments have been critiqued and chewed over for many hours now, but let's set a baseline here. At a bare minimum, the president said that folks who marched alongside or near self-proclaimed white nationalists chanting racist, anti-Semitic, and Nazi slogans, at a bare minimum, he called these very fine people.
You had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people. They were people protesting very quietly the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee. You had a lot of people in that group that were there to innocently protest.
Very fine people. So make no mistake, this is an important moment, a different moment, which is developing before our eyes this morning. So what now? Let's go first to Jeff Zeleny at Trump Tower. You know, Jeff, they've had a night to digest and see the reaction to the president's statement. Wondering if you're getting a sense from inside the White House staff, the Trump team, how they think things are going this morning.
Good morning, John. The people inside the White House and indeed here at Trump Tower, inside the president's inner circle, have been virtually silent. There's been no comment from Ivanka Trump, from Jared Kushner, from any of the top advisors. This is the most uncharacteristically silent White House that I have seen in such a critical moment here, John. The reason is this. There's not a lot of defense going on. Usually you hear advisors trying to defend the president, explain what he was saying. Well, this is a much harder moment to explain and defend. So I am struck by the silence this morning, John. But let's go back to those comments yesterday in Trump Tower. Of course, they started the week by the president was trying to clear up his comments from the weekend with a scripted statement. Yesterday, that statement was anything but scripted, but it came right from his heart. Let's listen.
What about the alt-left that came charging at the, as you say, the alt-right? Do they have any semblance of guilt?
Let me
ask you this. What about the fact they came charging with clubs in their hands, swinging clubs? Do they have any problem? I think they do. I watched those very closely, much more closely than you people watched it. And you have you had a group on one side that was bad, and you had a group on the other side that was also very violent. and nobody wants to say that, but I'll say it right now. You had a group on one side and you had a group on the other, and they came at each other with clubs, and it was vicious, and it was horrible, and it was a horrible thing to watch. But there is another side. There was a group on this side, you can call them the left, you've just called them the left, that came violently attacking the other group. So you can say what you want, but that's the way it is.
On both sides, sir? You said there was hatred, there was violence on both sides.
Well, I do think there's blame, yes. I think there's blame on both sides.
And it is those words there, John, blame on both sides, that has put the president back in a far deeper hole than he was over the weekend when he was criticized by many Republicans for not condemning the hate and the violence at that Charlottesville rally over the weekend. But, John, again, the White House, we're not expected. We're told the president will not be talking anymore today. He's not been tweeting about this specifically. He'll be going back to his golf course and resort in New Jersey this afternoon. We'll see if we hear from him or from any of his other advisors. His daughter and son-in-law, of course, are on vacation. A lot of advisors are, as I said, silent before and not defending or talking about the president. There's no talk of resignations. There's chatter, as there always is in Washington, about what people will do. But Republicans on Capitol Hill, other ones we're talking to this morning, John, are disappointed in their president. So we'll see where this goes. One side note in terms of staffing, we are learning this morning that Hope Hicks, the president's longtime communications advisor, she is on track to perhaps become the new communications director at the White House. That is a big job as well, John.
All right, Jeff Zeleny for us outside Trump Tower. I mentioned Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump. They somehow let it be known that they were not there, that they are on vacation right now while the president has been saying what he's been saying. That fact tends to leak out whenever the president does something controversial. Here to discuss, CNN senior political reporter Nia Malika Henderson, CNN political analyst and Washington correspondent for The New Yorker Ryan Lizza, and Selena Zito, a CNN contributor and Washington Examiner reporter and columnist for The New York Post. Nia, I asked a lot of what now questions at the top of this show. One of the big questions is what now for Republicans? There have not been many elected Republicans. In fact, I haven't seen any Republican elected officials out defending the President of the United States this morning. What we have seen is more reaction like this from Governor John Kasich.
Pathetic, isn't it? Just pathetic listening to this and hearing these marchers. The president has to totally condemn this. And this is not about winning an argument. This is about the fact that now these folks apparently are going to go other places and they think that they had some sort of a victory. There is no moral equivalency between the KKK, the neo-Nazis, and anybody else.
That's just a taste of the words you're hearing. John Kasich, maybe not a surprising critic of the president, but there have been others as well, many others, and as I said, no defenders. The question, though, Nia, is do you think that these Republican elected officials will treat the president differently now? Has their relationship fundamentally changed with the president of the United States?
If you look at a lot of the statements, the tweets, right, from people like Marco Rubio, others who have tweeted, some of them are, for one, reluctant to actually call the president out by name. I think Marco Rubio did do that. Others have been reluctant to do that. So, given the seriousness of this, which I think John Kasich there really articulates, this is a matter of public safety. This is a matter of an American president giving aid and comfort to a group that wants to do great harm to other Americans. Given that seriousness, the fact that I think most of these Republicans so far have been fairly weak in terms of their condemnation of the president, not even really condemning the president, condemning his words, but nothing very personal in terms of the president. You think about Marco Rubio, called President Obama one of the most divisive figures in modern history. I mean, those were his words for President Obama. And he hasn't given this sort of similar critique of this president. I think you're going to have Republicans who have to figure out what they're going to do with this president. I mean, they obviously like his agenda, and they have to figure out whether or not backing that agenda ultimately means that they're going to be standing beside a president who in word seems to have some sympathies for white supremacists. That's a major, major thing for them and the Republican Party. Remember, the Republican Party has tried to get away from that. I think they're going to have to do some soul searching in terms of their own history with kind of playing the race card with racial polarization through these last many decades. And Donald Trump is just the most, I think, egregious outgrowth of what we've seen from Republicans for many decades.
So Ryan, Liz, those are elected Republicans. What about Republicans, actually, and some Democrats, frankly, who work inside the White House for President Donald Trump? Our friend Maggie Haberman is reporting that Gary Cohn, who's Jewish, is disgusted. Well, disgusted and upset with the president's statement. Gary Cohn, along with Steve Mnuchin, also Jewish, stood beside the president, along with the chief of staff, John Kelly, who looked pretty uncomfortable, people noted, during that whole statement.
Head down,
What do you make of the White House staff? The rumor is that Cohn's upset. To what end? He's just going to be upset, write a strongly worded letter? Or?
Exactly. I mean, there are a number of options for both members of Congress.
Staff, the rumor is that Cohn's upset. To what end? He's just going to be upset, write a strongly worded letter? Or?
Exactly. I mean, there are a number of options for both members of Congress and people who work in the White House. If you work in the White House and you leak anonymously that you are upset, that's not taking any moral or principled stand against what the president did. You either have to speak out publicly and risk losing your job, or resign because you find it too morally reprehensible to work for a president that gives aid and comfort to Nazis and the KKK. Traditionally in America, the president would be the voice of moral authority on issues like this. Since he has abdicated that role, Congress now has to step in and do something. If you are a member of Congress, especially if you are a Republican, you can send out a tweet and say you disagree with the president, but I think we're at a place where there has to be more. Democrats are calling for hearings. There's a rising tide of anti-Semitism and far-right violence and activism in this country. Congress should step in, perhaps, and hold some hearings. Maybe someone in Congress should present a resolution if they find what the president did so reprehensible. There could be a resolution in the House that condemns what President Trump did. I mean, we have a system of checks and balances for a reason, and because the president has failed here, Congress now has to step in and have that moral voice that the president has given up. That's my view, anyway.
Selena, you know, you have your finger on the pulse of the Trump voter here, and we love your reporting. You do terrific reporting on this. But you note that if the president thinks he's doing this for them, if he thinks he is making the statements and handling this the way that he has for those Trump voters out there that you talk to so frequently, he's fundamentally misreading what they like about him.
Yeah, he was elected to be a doer. He was also elected in a succession of presidencies that have been politics of conflict. And what people have been looking for is a politics of results, right? There haven't been enough results for a lot of these voters. He is fundamentally misreading these voters. They want him to do something, right? And this isn't the thing they want him to do. You know, they don't benefit from his grudge with the press. And I suspect part of what happened was yesterday, from what I understand, it was an infrastructure event. Well, you know, infrastructure is why a lot of working class Democrats voted for him, right? There was nothing about infrastructure. He went out there with a bee in his bonnet, and he wanted to, you know, poke the eye in the press because he was mad at the press. Well, nobody that votes for him gets to benefit from that grudge, right? I mean, they might not like our profession, but at the end of the day, they're there for results for their family, for their personal lives, for their communities, for the country. And he is not providing them by doing this. He gets in the way of himself, and he gets in the way. He is not going to have a successful presidency if he just continues to go down this rabbit hole.
You know, I didn't see that. I mean, that press conference wasn't about poking the press. We've seen Donald Trump do that very effectively at times. That press conference was about embracing and, in some ways, exonerating white supremacists. I mean, if you read the transcript of it, I mean, it's mostly about he's sort of demonizing the alt left, and in some ways demonizing the alt left more than the alt right. Right? He frames the alt right as sort of innocent bystanders who were there to peacefully assemble, as if this was on Friday, some sort of candlelight vigil, and the alt-left charging. I mean, it wasn't even both sides. No. It was more like the alt-left was more guilty. So this idea that this was about the press, it wasn't. No. And I think we also forget the ways in which Donald Trump's presidency was in some ways based on racial resentment and white grievance politics. This idea of building a wall, this idea of banning Muslims from certain countries, this idea of deporting illegal immigrants. Remember, when he announced, he talked about Mexicans as rapists. I mean, you know, I think we talk about sort of the economic piece of it. There was also a cultural nationalist piece as well.
Selena, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I think what you were saying is if he thought he was delivering a press critique, what he actually was delivering was a defense of a strange set of moral values that many, maybe even perhaps most Trump voters don't want to get anywhere near.
Yeah, I didn't mean the context of what he said. I'm sorry I didn't make that clear. What I meant is that he was...
Removal of Robert E. Lee and other Confederate statues is, quote, changing history, even conflating Lee with Presidents George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. This can be a little bit of a complex subject, but it matters now more than ever. So let's bring in Harold Holzer. He's a leading historian of the Civil War era and author of Lincoln and the Power of the Press. Harold, a pleasure. Good to have you here. Good to be here. So let's talk about what the concepts are that are involved here. The president saying, who's next? Washington, Jefferson. Why does that make sense? Why does it not make sense?
Well, it's false equivalency, like the other comments we've been hearing. One set of people, the founders, may have been hypocritical in their concept of liberty, but they created the foundations of government. They articulated the vision of all men are created equal, even if they weren't prepared to live by it. The Confederate heroes, quote unquote, who are memorialized and monumentalized in the South, defied that tradition and their own bloodlines in some case. And they try to wreck the republic that the founders had created. And it was all about slavery, the one stain on the founders' concept of the country.
And Robert E. Lee, leading general in a war that claimed 600,000 lives. I think context is important because I bet a lot of Americans don't know when most of these statues went up. Most of them went up at 2 points. First, during the turn of the century in Jim Crow, and second, in the 50s and 60s during the Civil Rights Movement. And that matters a lot, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, there are two subjects here, history and memory. History is not erasable. We know what happened. We know the death toll, which most historians now think is 750,000, which is worse than we'd imagined for a century. But the way that memory was altered to create heroism out of destructiveness and out of clinging to human bondage and inequality is the truly disturbing part. The statues fall somewhere in the middle for me, but that's another story. The first major statue of Lee was like a mummy lying down, hands on chest, in the college, the chapel of the college that he was president of in retirement. Sort of appropriate. His cause was over and he was dead, and so was the idea of secession and slavery. But then he stood up in the next series of statues and eventually rose to the might of the symbolic might of an equestrian portrait, which is a whole different story.
And while you get, and of course, there's an iconology issue here about why they put you on a horse and what that's supposed to symbolize in terms of dominance and prowess, and the timing and the fact that he had no connection to Charlottesville in personal or military history. He was just there, as you would suggest, in your face about the Confederacy, and yet the president seems to be deferential to it. What does that mean to you about what's in his head?
I don't think he knows that much about history. I don't think anything is in his head except people didn't like his first statement. That's my political view, which I'll try not to dwell on because I'm supposed to talk about the statues. I don't think he gets it. I don't think he knows the difference between history and memory. I don't know how I don't think he knows the history, and I certainly don't think he understands the nuances of memory.
But that's dangerous.
It's highly dangerous. You've got, not only should we have maybe a week ago discussed whether these statues are so offensive to so many people that they ought to be either counter-sculptured, as they did in Richmond. Big statue of Lee, big statue of Jackson Davis. And what did the people of Richmond do? They put up a statue of Arthur Ashe to confront them. I mean, and the controversy was unbelievable, by the way, tragic. But they did it. And maybe there should be Frederick Douglass in Maryland, for example, where they're taking down a statue of Roger Taney. They already have Thurgood Marshall. There have been these ideas of doing parallel statues to give both sides of the story. what the president has done, unfortunately, along with the demonstrators, but what he has condoned is the idea that these statues are the touchstones for a movement to resurrect the Ku Klux Klan and Nazism. And that's so abhorrent that I think the statues are going to be the losers and maybe deserve to be the losers at this point.
Professor, thank you. It's important, an important history lesson for everyone. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being with us today. We'll see you back here tomorrow morning. Quick break, then Newsroom with John Berman.
Continue Declassified. Saturday night at 9 on CNN.
The rabbi who offered a prayer at President Trump's inauguration is speaking out, disagreeing with how the president's response to the deadly violence in Charlottesville came across. Rabbi Marvin here joins us now. Rabbi, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. What do you make of what the president said yesterday?
Well, if the president would have asked me, I would have advised him that you cannot equate neo-Nazis, the Klan, and white supremacists with the other demonstrators. Because those three, that's a code word for an America without Jews, for an America without African Americans, and without Latinos. Now, it's true that in every demonstration, you may have average citizens that violate the law. But the President of the United States should make it very clear that is no comparison with the bigots and haters that is represented in the philosophy of neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and the Klan. And let me say something else. These demonstrations are very dangerous. People forget. The Third Reich started with small demonstrations. It got bigger and bigger, and the next thing we know is that Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Nazi Germany. So if the president would have asked me, I would have told him, Mr. President, go out there, condemn these racists and bigots, and that's all. And I make one other comment. It takes away from, in my opinion, from some of the good things President Trump has done, like standing up tough to the North Korean dictator. You can't kick the ball down the line. If we stood up to him 15 years ago, we wouldn't be facing intercontinental missiles today. And the fact that he went to Saudi Arabia trying to make peace between the Saudis and the Israelis. But all that is being distracted by what has happened, the terrible events in Charlottesville.
Well, but here's the thing, Rabbi. This is about what's in his heart, what happened yesterday. Because you have to explain why he did it. And that answer is going to wind up casting a shadow or a ray of sunlight on everything else that happens. Because if someone wants to defend these types of haters, it doesn't matter what they do with North Korea. It doesn't matter how good a negotiator they are abroad. Because the presidency is about moral agency. And I know you know this was part of your prayer. So why do you think the president chose to say what he said yesterday, something that's so clearly wrong to you and so many others?
I have no idea. I've tried to analyze it. I have no idea. I think that the president should correct this course. He should choose an occasion now to make it very clear that there's no comparison between other demonstrators on the left and bigots like Nazis, the Klan, and white supremacists. And I would make one other comment, which I think is very important. You know, there's other bigots in the world. There's often inconsistencies in our society. The greatest deniers of the Holocaust today in the world are the Iranians. We schmooze with them. We invite them to cocktail parties. They're on television. Their diplomats are welcome, and we don't take them to task that they say the Holocaust never happened. The world has forgotten. On the very day that the Ayatollah said there was no Holocaust, President Rouhani was received by the Pope in the Vatican. Why would the Pope I would have said, you're not welcome until your leader stops saying that the Holocaust never happened.
Rabbi, I appreciate your thoughts on this. You were a powerful voice on the day of the inauguration. You're a powerful voice as well. Be well.
Thank you.
Copy.
The statue of Robert E. Lee still stands in Charlottesville, but overnight one came down in Baltimore. We're going to talk about the
top of another hour. We want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world. This is New Day. Allison is off. Poppy Harlow is joining me for this week. It's good to have you. Need you here. President Trump is under fire for once again blaming both sides for the violence that killed a woman in Charlottesville. The president's condemnation of white supremacists on Monday seemingly rendered meaningless because he once again equated the actions of hateful racists with those protesting against them.
So Republicans in Congress are united in denouncing hate, but very few are calling out the president by name and laying this in his lap. Newspapers this morning around the country rebuking President Trump with scathing headlines, blistering editorials as this nation today mourns the death of Heather Heyer, her memorial service to be held in just hours. And another American city, this time Baltimore, removes Confederate monuments overnight.
All right. The president, his press conference yesterday, wasn't even supposed to be about this topic, but became all about it for him, the media, and the country. Here's a little bit of it. The president in his own words.
Well, I do think there's blame. Yes, I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either. What about the alt left that came charging at him? Excuse me. What about the alt left that came charging at the, as you say, the alt right? Do they have any semblance of guilt? Let me ask you this. What about the fact that they came charging with clubs in their hands, swinging clubs? Do they have any problem? I think they do.
All right, let's bring in our panel, CNN politics reporter and editor-at-large, Chris Cillizza, CNN senior political commentator and former Obama senior advisor, David Axelrod, and anchor of CNN Tonight, Don Lemon. The president's factual basis about this being like equal combatants on the ground. Our sister network, HBO, was on the ground there. Vice took footage. We want to show you. Here's what was being said and done on the ground.
Spread ideas, talk, in the hopes that somebody more capable will come along and do that. Somebody like Donald Trump, who does not give his daughter to a Jew.
So Donald Trump, but like more racist.
A lot more racist than Donald Trump. I don't think that you could feel about race the way I do and watch that Kushner bastard walk around with that beautiful girl.
Don, the president wants to talk about the fact basis here. Just to be clear, yeah, they had a permit. But this was supposed to be moved to a different site. They didn't want it moved. They actually won the legal battle because they wanted this congested. They wanted this to be as provocative as possible. They wound up being cited for unlawful assembly because of what happened. But this really isn't about the facts, right? This is about moral agency. What do you make of the president saying it's wrong on both sides?
No one has a permit to hate, right? And for hateful behavior. We all know the history of the Klan. We all know the history of white supremacy. And as I watched the president yesterday, all I could think of was this is a ramblings of a very ill-informed, ignorant man who's ignorant of the history of this country, of the facts of what went on the ground, and who obviously is saying exactly what is in his heart when he is not on teleprompter. This is what he believes. There is no other way around it. He said it in so many terms after being questioned about it over and over and over again. He is ill-informed. He doesn't know the history of this country. He should go back to school and get an elementary history education of what the difference is between a hate group and a protest group who is protesting fascism and who's protesting racism and bigotry. It is a sad state of affairs in this country right now when you have a president of the United States defending bigots, defending the offspring of the Ku Klux Klan in this country.
David Axelrod, you worked in the White House, and there's a big question this morning as we watch the people around the president, his cabinet members like Gary Cohn, like Steve Mnuchin, who are both Jewish, standing by the president, General Kelly, chief of staff, with his arms crossed. Glenn Thrush of the New York Times is reporting this morning, he just tweeted that Gary Cohn, who heads the NEC, is Jewish, was disgusted and upset, both in quotes, by the president's comments on white nationalists according to 3 different people with knowledge. Okay, that's one thing. And then what do you do about it? You worked in the White House. If you fundamentally disagree with what the president has done, can you stand by? Should you stand by?
Look, I think a lot of people are going to have to wrestle with that question. I have a sense that some of these people are telling themselves, look, I'm the thin blue line between an unstable president and the rest of the world, and therefore I should stay here and try and guide him. And the question is, how much can he be guided? But let me just say generally, you know, I share in the outrage and disappointment. I'm the son of a Jewish refugee, so I very much feel that. But I'm not surprised, because this is exactly who the president was when he was running for president. He retweeted neo-Nazi tweets. He retweeted white supremacist tweets. He said things that caused Speaker Ryan to say last year that he had engaged in the textbook of a racist comment. You know, and so now he is who he is. Michelle Obama said in her convention speech, the presidency doesn't change you, it reveals you. This is who Donald Trump is. So the question is, who are we? Who are we now as a country, and how are we going to react to this? He is not going to change, but are we going to react to what he has said and done, and to this sort of embrace of racism? And that is a question for Republicans. It's a question for Democrats. It's a question for all of us.
Yeah, well, Chris Cillizza, David Axelrod just mentioned Paul Ryan. Who's that? I haven't heard from him. He tweeted. You know, they're saying, well, we're on vacation now. I mean, you know, what is going on here right now? He didn't even mention the president by name. John McCain did in his tweet. But I mean, look, you know, again, the job is to fight injustice and to reinforce morality, to stand firm. How do these men and women justify being so quiet? We couldn't get them on television this morning. This wasn't to defend the health care bill that doesn't make a lot of sense, according to the CBO and others. This is about moral agency and about, fighting hate. And we got one congressman, Scott Taylor of Virginia, who came on and said the president was wrong, he failed yesterday. None of them would even come on.
They're cowards. They're cowards. That's why. They're cowards.
They don't want to talk about it, and they should. Because, again, I think you're seeing this in a political light, just like Donald Trump was trying to paint it. Well, on the one side, people do this, on the other side, people do that, which is just, frankly, not true. And as Don rightly pointed out, on the one side, you have hate-filled people who want to eliminate people because of what they believe or what they look like. On the other side, you have people who don't agree with that viewpoint. That is not a reasonable argument. When you try to put it in a political context, place it on a political spectrum, I'm sure their advisors say, stay away from this. This is radioactive. You talking about neo-Nazism, white supremacy, and Donald Trump is a 100% stone cold loser. The problem here is that this isn't a political issue. It really isn't. I mean, of course, we're talking about it in the context of politics because Donald Trump's the president of the United States. But this is moral. This is a moral issue of moral leadership. Can we condemn things as a society that are based on hate and intolerance? And the answer to that has to be yes, right? I'd remind people, this Republican Party, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, lots of other folks, I went through 2 days ago, before this press conference, I went through and found 9 instances in which some, many, or all of them denounced, ran away from, said they could not support Donald Trump over the past 2 years, to David Axelrod's point. This is not new, and yet here we are, pushing his health care bill. You know, at some point, I do think you have to stand up and say, this isn't about politics. This is about morality. This is about doing what is right, and this is clearly wrong. Now, where do you go from there? Because Donald Trump ain't changing, right? So where do you take that as a Paul Ryan or Mitch McConnell? It is harder to determine. But I do think you need to stand up and say, this isn't what we are. This isn't what we stand for.